What if I told you that the most disciplined army in the ancient world once marched, single file, straight into its own grave, and never even saw the men who killed them? How does an army of 25,000 trained soldiers simply vanish in a single foggy morning? On a cold morning in late June, more than 2,000 years ago, a thick fog rolled in off the surface of an Italian lake and swallowed the road that ran along its northern shore. Out of that fog marched a Roman army, somewhere between 25,000 and 30,000 men, strung out in a long, thin line, with the still water on one side and the silent hills on the other. They could barely see the man marching in front of them, and what they could not see at all were the tens of thousands of enemy soldiers crouched in total silence on the slopes just above their heads. Within 3 hours, most of these men would be dead. Some of them cut down where they stood on the muddy shoreline, and others dragged beneath the surface of the lake, drowned by the very armor that was built to keep them alive. I have spent most of my life studying warfare, and I still find it hard to believe this actually happened. It is remembered even today as the largest and most perfect ambush ever sprung on a battlefield, and the man who designed that trap did the whole thing with only one good eye. To understand how a full Roman army walked in a straight line into the one place it could never escape, and why that very lesson would one day help save a young nation called America, we have to go all the way back to the beginning. Before we walk down to that shoreline together, let me say thank you. Thank you for being here, for giving me your time, and for caring about stories that most people have long forgotten. If you find something worth keeping in the next few minutes, take a second to subscribe and stay with me, because this is a story that rewards the patient. Now let me take you back. By the spring of that fateful year, the man who would build this trap was already the most feared name in the entire Mediterranean world. He came from a wealthy trading empire on the coast of North Africa, near the spot where the modern city of Tunis sits today. That empire and Rome had already fought one long and brutal war over the island of Sicily, and his side had lost. He grew up in the long shadow of that defeat, and there is an old story that when he was just a boy, his father took him to an altar and made him swear a solemn oath, promising that he would be the enemy of Rome for as long as he drew breath. Whether that story is true or not almost does not matter, because he spent every single year of his adult life acting like a man who had made exactly that promise. And the year before this battle, he had done something that nearly everyone believed was flat-out impossible. Instead of sailing against Rome by sea, the way any sensible commander would, he marched an entire army out of Spain, across the south of France, and straight over the snow-covered peaks of the Alps in the dead of autumn. He brought foot soldiers, he brought horsemen, and he even brought war elephants up through icy mountain passes where men froze to death in the night and animals lost their footing and slid off the cliffs into the valleys far below. He lost thousands of soldiers on that crossing, but the men who came down the other side into northern Italy were hardened, they were loyal, and they were led by a commander who had just proven, in front of the whole world, that he would attempt the impossible and live to tell about it. Now, before we go any further, I want to be honest with you about how we even know these things, because it matters. Almost everything we understand about this campaign comes down to two ancient writers, and I trust one of them a great deal more than the other. One of them actually walked the very route this army took, roughly 60 years after it happened, tracing the path with his own feet, and that is the kind of detail that makes a historian sit up and pay attention. So when I tell you what happened, understand that it is built on the closest thing the ancient world left us to an eyewitness. And here is the part that so many people miss about this commander. The force that came down out of those mountains was not one single national army the way Rome fielded its legions. It was a patchwork of peoples from all across the Western Mediterranean, and every one of them brought a different and deadly skill to the table. There were tough, stubborn foot soldiers from Spain and from North Africa who could plant their feet and win an ugly close-quarters brawl. There were thousands of fierce warriors from the tribes of northern Italy who had joined him for one simple reason. They hated Rome. There were slingers from a chain of islands in the Western Sea who could put a lead shot clean through a man's skull from a shocking distance. And above all of them, There were the light horsemen from Africa, riders so skilled they used no saddle and no bridle, who could appear, strike, and vanish faster than any Roman could ever react. This one commander had learned how to take these wildly different fighters and weld them into a single weapon, and at that lake, he would use each of their strengths at precisely the right moment. Because you have to understand something about how this man's mind worked. He did not simply want to win his battles. Any ordinary general can win with more men and sharper swords. No, he wanted to win them by luring his enemy into a position where they could not win, no matter how brave they were, and he had already proven it twice, crushing one Roman force at a river crossing and then destroying a much larger one in a freezing winter fight, luring them across icy water on empty stomachs before striking from a hidden flank. Keep that pattern in the back of your mind, because you are about to watch him do it one more time, on a scale the world had never seen. So when the new year began, Rome was rattled, but it was very far from beaten, because the Romans were a stubborn and proud people. Every spring they elected 2 consuls, their highest political and military leaders, and that year one of those consuls was a man who is going to become very important to our story. He was not born into the old noble families that usually ran the city. He was a self-made politician, a man of the common people, popular with ordinary citizens and with the rank-and-file soldiers, and he carried a reputation for being aggressive, impatient, and just a little too certain of himself. And this is the detail I really want you to hold on to, because it is the hinge the whole battle turns on. This was a man who felt he had something to prove. He believed the commanders before him had been too cautious, too timid, even cowardly, and he was absolutely convinced that the right way to deal with this invader was to march straight at him and crush him in a stand-up fight. Now here is the tragedy hiding in plain sight. That belief, that very hunger to prove himself in front of the public, was the exact thing his enemy was counting on. You could not have designed a more perfect victim if you tried. The Roman consul took up a strong position with his army at a town in Tuscany, blocking the road south and standing between the invader and Rome itself. On paper, it was a sound plan. But his enemy had absolutely no intention of throwing men against a strong position head-on, and instead, he did something so miserable and so unexpected that nobody saw it coming. To slip past that army without a fight, he led his entire force through a stretch of flooded marshland along a river, terrain so wet and rotten that no sane person believed an army would even attempt it. For days on end, his soldiers waded through stagnant water and deep, sucking mud, unable to lie down to sleep, perching on top of dead pack animals or piles of baggage just to keep their heads above the swamp. Disease tore through the ranks, and the commander himself, riding on the last surviving elephant he had, came down with a savage infection in his eyes from the endless damp and the total lack of rest. He lost the sight in one of them, and he would be blind in that eye for the rest of his life. In fact, by the time this ordeal was over, nearly all of his war elephants were gone. He paid a brutal price for that shortcut, but when his army finally dragged itself out of the marshes and onto dry ground, he had done it. He was now behind the Roman army. He had slipped completely around them and planted himself squarely between the Romans and the road home. And now comes the part that shows you just how deeply this man understood the human beings he was fighting. He did not turn and politely offer a battle. Instead, he began to march south through the rich Italian countryside, and as he marched, he burned it. He torched the farms, he looted the villages, and he destroyed the fields and the property of Rome's allies, and he did all of it in plain sight of the Roman army. He was deliberately humiliating that proud consul in front of his own soldiers and in front of the entire region, and the message could not have been clearer. Your great Roman leader is too frightened to stop me, and he is letting your homes burn to the ground. It was a calculated insult, and it worked exactly the way he hoped it would. The wiser officers urged patience. They wanted to wait for the second consul to bring up his army so the two forces could combine and finally outnumber the enemy, and that was the smart move, the safe move. But the consul could not stand the thought of sitting still, while the countryside burned and the whole world watched him do nothing. His pride was on the line. His political future was on the line. And his temper finally got the better of his judgment. He ordered his men to break camp and chase the invader down, certain he would catch him and force the fight he was sure he could win. He was, without ever realizing it, marching straight toward the spot that had already been chosen for him. And I have to tell you, the old writers say that the gods themselves seemed to reach out and warn this man, and that he brushed aside every single warning. The Romans took their omens with deadly seriousness before any military action, and on the very morning he gave the order to march, the signs were said to be terrible. When he went to climb onto his horse, the animal suddenly stumbled and threw him headfirst to the ground. And when the men went to lift the sacred standards, the holy banners the army carried into battle, one of them was stuck so firmly in the earth that they could not pull it free, no matter how hard they strained. To a deeply religious Roman, these were not small things. These were the heavens screaming at him to stop, to wait, to turn back, and he waved all of it away. Now, whether you believe in omens or you do not, I want you to sit with what that moment really tells us about the man, because it is a truth as old as human nature itself. He had already decided what he wanted to happen, and he was no longer listening to anything, human or divine, that dared to tell him otherwise. And I promise you this, that exact state of mind, that stubborn certainty, is the precise thing every great trapper prays to find in his prey. So let me take you to the ground itself, because the place is the whole story. The road south ran along the northern edge of a wide, shallow lake, and along part of that shoreline the hills came down close to the water, leaving only a narrow strip of flat land for the road to pass through. Picture it almost like a long corridor, with the still water on one side and steep, wooded slopes rising up on the other. It ran through a tight gap in the hills, and then opened out into what I can only describe as a natural amphitheater, a stretch of ground roughly 5 miles long and as much as 1.5 miles wide, ringed by high ground on nearly every side. At the far eastern end, the hills pressed in again until they almost touched the edge of the lake. And I want you to think like a hunter for a moment, because that is exactly what happened here. If you sat down and tried to design the perfect place to trap and destroy an army, you could hardly do better than this. Any force marching through it would be stretched thin into a single fragile line, unable to spread out into a proper battle formation, with nowhere to run and open water at their backs. He looked at this terrain and he did not see a road. He saw a finished killing field. All he had to do was fill it. So on the night before the battle, he arranged his army with the patience and care of a man quietly setting a snare in the dark. He took his heaviest, most reliable foot soldiers, his seasoned veterans, and he placed them on the high ground at the far end of the corridor, right where the Romans would expect to run into the tail of his marching column. These men were two things at once. They were the visible bait, and they were the cork in the bottle. Then he took the rest of his army and he hid it, spreading his men in total silence along the length of the hills that overlooked the road, tucking his light infantry, his slingers, and his javelin throwers into the trees and the folds of the slopes. And his fast-moving horsemen, the deadly riders from Africa, he positioned right near the entrance of the corridor, hidden and coiled and waiting. Every single man knew his job. Nobody was to move. Nobody was to make a sound. Not until the signal came. The trap was set the way a hunter stretches a line of nets across a valley, and now all they had to do was wait for the prey to walk in. And listen, if you are gripped by this, if you can feel the tension of those men waiting in the dark, do me a quick favor and hit that subscribe button, because there is so much more to come. The morning the Romans arrived could not have been more perfect for him if he had ordered the weather himself. A heavy mist had settled over the lake and the low ground, the kind of thick, early fog that hangs in the air and blurs everything more than a few feet away. Up on the hills, where his men were waiting, the air was clear, and they could look down through that fog and watch the Roman army moving below them, like ghosts. But the Romans, down in the murk along the shoreline, could see almost nothing. They could not see the slopes. They could not see the men on the slopes. And here is the single detail that turns a tragedy into a full-blown catastrophe. In his desperate hurry to catch his enemy, the Roman consul had pushed his army into that corridor without ever sending out proper scouts to check the high ground first. He simply assumed the enemy was somewhere up ahead on the road. He had absolutely no idea that the hills on his left were already crawling with thousands of soldiers staring down at the back of his neck. So the Roman column poured into the gap between the hills and the lake, marching blind through the fog. Thousands of men spread thin along miles of narrow road. And the moment their enemy judged that the bulk of that army was fully inside, with the entrance sealed behind them and the exit blocked ahead, he gave the signal. And what happened next was less like a battle and far more like an avalanche. His hidden troops came screaming down the hillsides into the fog, slamming into the side of that Roman column all along its length at the very same instant. The Romans were caught completely off guard, marching in a thin line, weapons not even ready, no formation, no order, and no idea where the attack was coming from in the mist. There was no time to do the one thing Roman soldiers were trained to do better than any army on earth, which was locked together into tight, disciplined ranks. Officers screamed orders that no one could follow because no one could see, and the units tangled hopelessly into one another. Men were fighting and dying before they even understood they were in a battle at all. The most feared war machine in the world, the finest heavy infantry ever assembled, was reduced in a matter of minutes to a panicking, screaming crowd trapped in a corridor of death. The slaughter lasted around 3 hours, though for the men caught inside it, I imagine it felt both endless and far too fast. Down near the front, the consul himself fought to rally his soldiers, riding through the chaos, trying with everything he had to hold his men together, and he was cut down in the fighting, struck dead by a horseman from one of the tribes that had joined the invasion. And with their commander gone, and their formation shattered, whatever order remained simply collapsed. Some men were pinned against the steep hillsides with no way to climb to safety. Others were driven backward, step by step, until they simply ran out of land. And behind them was the lake. This is the image that has haunted me since the first time I read about it. Thousands of soldiers pushed to the very edge of the water, facing an impossible choice. Stand and be cut down on the shore or wade out into the lake in full battle gear and pray you can swim. So they went into the water, in their heavy bronze and iron armor, with shields still strapped to their arms. And I think you already know what happens to a man in full armor in deep water. They sank. They were dragged straight down and drowned in the shallows by the very equipment that was supposed to save their lives, while the horsemen rode along the shoreline and finished off anyone still within reach. The lake that gave this battle its name had become a mass grave. Not every man died down there in the fog. The few thousand soldiers at the very front of the column managed to punch clean through the blocking force in the confusion and fight their way out of the corridor, and they reached higher ground and turned around, only to watch, completely helpless, as the army behind them was wiped out in the mist below. They marched on, hoping to escape, but the horsemen came after them, and the very next day, surrounded and out of options, that group surrendered as well. And when the dust finally settled and the fog lifted off the water, the numbers were almost impossible to believe. Around 15,000 Romans lay dead. Roughly 6,000 more were taken prisoner. An entire consular army, one of the main fighting forces of the Roman Republic, had essentially ceased to exist in a single morning. And the man who did this, by comparison, had lost only around 1,500 men, most of them from the tribal warriors who bore the brunt of that first screaming charge. One ancient writer puts his losses even a little higher, closer to 2,500, but either way, it was one of the most lopsided victories in the entire history of warfare. And the bleeding did not even stop there. The second Roman consul, still bringing up his own forces, had sent ahead a detachment of around 4,000 cavalry, not yet knowing there was no longer an army left to reinforce. Our commander heard about those approaching horsemen, sent one of his best officers to deal with them, and within 2 days every last one of them was killed or captured. In the span of about 48 hours, Rome had lost a full army and a huge chunk of its cavalry on top of it. Now, I want to pause here, because this is the part that truly matters, the part that separates a simple slaughter from a work of genius. He did not destroy that army because his men were braver, or because he had better weapons. He destroyed it because he understood the ground, he understood the weather, and above all, he understood the man he was fighting. He knew that Consul was proud and impatient, so he provoked that pride on purpose by burning the countryside in front of his eyes. He used the fog to steal away the one advantage the Romans had left, which was simply their vision. Every single piece of this was planned. The genius was never in the fighting. The genius was in arranging things so that the fighting was already decided before the first sword was ever drawn. And then he did something with his prisoners that revealed the much deeper war he was really waging. He separated the captured men into two groups. The Roman citizens he kept in chains, but the soldiers who came from Rome's Italian allies he released and sent home without asking for a single coin of ransom. His message to them was simple, and it was brilliant. He told them he had not come to make war on the peoples of Italy, but only on Rome and its domination over them. He was trying to crack Rome's alliance system from the inside, because he understood that Rome's true strength was never just its legions. It was the vast network of allies that fed those legions, men and supplies. Win a battle, and you kill some soldiers. Break the alliance, and you kill the whole empire. When the news finally reached Rome, it arrived the way terrible news always does, slowly at first, and then all at once. A crowd gathered in the central square, desperate for word, and when a magistrate finally stood up and spoke the plain and awful truth out loud that the army had been crushed, the entire city fell into grief and fear. For days, women crowded the city gates, begging for any scrap of information about who had lived and who had died. Rome had not just lost a battle. Rome had lost the feeling that it could stop this man at all. And what Rome did next is the entire reason the Republic survived, and it is the greatest lesson in this whole story. They turned to a careful, patient, older statesman, and he did something that drove his fellow Romans absolutely crazy, but that turned out to be exactly right. He refused to fight the invader in a big open battle. He shadowed him, he harassed his supply lines, he stayed up on the high ground where those deadly horsemen could not reach him, but he never, ever gave the enemy the one thing he wanted most, which was a stand-up fight. The Romans mocked him for it. They called him the delayer, and they meant it as a pure insult. But he had understood the terrible lesson of that lake. Every single time the Romans charged this man in anger, they paid for it in blood. So he simply stopped charging. And in the end, that patience, that discipline, is what saved Rome. And centuries later, people would honor him with a line that still gives me chills, the idea that one man, simply by delaying, gave the whole nation back to its people. And here is the part I have been waiting to tell you, the part that brings this ancient fog all the way home to us. Because roughly 2,000 years later, that exact same strategy would help save a brand new nation, our nation. During the American Revolution, our first great commander, George Washington, was facing a British army that was larger, better trained, and better supplied than anything he could put in the field. And after a painful defeat early in the war, he made a choice. He stopped trying to win one glorious, decisive battle, and instead he adopted the patient, wearing down strategy of that old Roman delayer. He avoided the big fights he could not win. He kept his army alive. He made the enemy chase him and bleed for every mile. In fact, he did it so faithfully that history gave him a nickname, the American Fabius, named directly after that patient Roman. And it was not always popular, not even among the founders. One of them, John Adams, grew so frustrated with all the waiting that he complained he was sick of Fabian systems in every direction. But that patience, the very thing critics called cowardice in both Rome and in America, is precisely what won in the end. And this is not just some dusty old idea. The tactics used at that lake are still studied at West Point to this very day, and the mistake that proud consul made is still picked apart in classrooms training our officers right now. The same fog, the same lesson, more than 2,000 years later. So let me leave you where we started. Today, you can still walk that quiet northern shore. The lake is calm, the hills are green, and it is almost impossible to stand there and imagine 15,000 men dying in the mist in a single morning. But that is exactly what makes this story worth remembering. It was not won by the bigger army or the stronger soldiers. It was won by a one-eyed general who looked at a road, a lake, a line of hills, and a hot-tempered enemy, and saw a finished trap before a single blade was drawn. So the next time someone tells you that victory always goes to the side with more men and better weapons, I want you to remember the fog on that lake and the army that marched in a perfect straight line into the one place it could never escape. If this story moved you, do me a favor and subscribe so you never miss the next one, and then tell me down in the comments which battle should I take you to next.